My name is Rachel deQuina. I am married to Matt deQuina, and we have 2 kids. Landon is 10 and Charlie is 3. I was born and raised in Iloilo City, Philippines, where my parents have been missionaries since 1977. Shortly after I was born, it was discovered that I had a heart condition, and at 3 weeks old, I was flown to the United States for open heart surgery. When I turned 3, my parents took me back to the United States for my 3rd open heart surgery. And some of my earliest memories were being in the hospital at that time. And one of the things that sticks out to me the most was just the incredible support system my family had. When I turned 4, we went back to the Philippines, and I remember arriving in Iloilo City, and there was a big group of people outside the airport waiting to welcome us home, and I just remember being so excited to be back. Fast forward a few months later, and I got saved. The weeks and months leading up to that, my parents talked to me all the time about God and heaven and about Jesus dying on the cross, but they never pressured me into a decision. And then one day it just clicked, and I went up to my mom and I told her I want to get saved. And I remember sitting on my parents' bed and listening to my mom explain Bible verses to me before I eagerly bowed my head and asked Jesus to be my Savior. A couple weeks later, my dad baptized me in our church. I had a very happy childhood. My brother and I loved growing up in the Philippines. We had exotic pets. We tried, different weird foods. Sometimes the exotic pets were our exotic foods. We grew up in a bamboo house. We had a ton of friends that we still keep in touch with to this day. We went to a small Christian school that was operated by our church, and on the weekends we were very involved in ministry. The Philippines is a tropical country, so we loved being outdoors, going camping, playing sports. Life was just one big adventure. Even though I was an active, very feisty child, I still had a heart condition, and I was immunocompromised. And living in a tropical third world country, it seemed that every tropical third world disease that came my way I caught, and I ended up being hospitalized a lot throughout my childhood because of that. Besides that, my mom would have to take me to regular cardiologist visits in the Philippines, and besides that, we would have to go to the United States once a year for a proper heart checkup at a children's hospital. Looking back now as a mom, I can only imagine what a huge sacrifice that was for my parents and how stressful that must have been for them. But God always provided, and He always saw us through. It actually turned out to be a blessing going to the States every year, because most missionaries aren't able to do that. Most missionaries aren't able to see their families every year, but because of my illness, we were able to go to the United States every year and visit with family. And looking back, I think that also helped prepare me to move to the United States later on for college. When I became a teenager, my doctors started talking about preparing me for my next open heart surgery. This would have been my 4th open heart surgery. They put me on medication, and they told me no more sports. I was fine with having heart surgery, but not being able to be active when I was so used to doing that every day was very, very difficult to accept. And, being a teenager, of course, I just thought life was so unfair. It was around this time that God put some excellent music teachers in my life. It was just perfect timing. I had taken violin and piano since I was 5, and it was very inconsistent, very on and off, and we had a hard time finding a teacher, and I absolutely hated lessons. I hated it. But my mom was old school, wouldn't let me quit. And then once sports was taken away and these amazing teachers popped up into my life, something changed, and I was all in. I was able to take on viola and cello, and besides piano and violin, and I spent hours every week taking lessons and practicing, and soon I was playing in church every week, and then when I turned 16, I started teaching violin. So it was just amazing how it all came together. My parents were my biggest cheerleaders when it came to music, and they spent time and money into starting an orchestra in our church. And looking back, I'm so thankful that I was able to be there when that started, and I had a small part in that. Today there is a full orchestra in the church, and they hold music clinics for churches all around the country, and they get invited to travel to public schools in the area, and it's just such a cool ministry, and I'm so grateful that I got to be part of that for a little bit. So I turned 18, and I still did not have that fourth open heart surgery that my doctors promised, and it was time to leave the Philippines to go to college. I graduated from high school, and I decided to go to Hyles-Anderson College in Indiana. I remember the day I left, there was, again, a big group of people that took me to the airport and said goodbye, and it was one of the most difficult days of my life. I did not want to leave. Thankfully, I had a friend in college who was a missionary kid as well, and she did her very best to help me adjust to life in a new school at a very strict college in a new country where I had to speak English all the time to everyone. And it was a difficult transition, but God is so good, and I met some really great people there, and I made some lifelong friends. During my time in college, I started getting weird symptoms and experiencing shortness of breath and dizzy spells and racing heartbeat, and my cardiologist thought maybe it was finally time for that open heart surgery. So I had a heart catheterization, and he decided that it would be okay to push it off for a couple of years. So my sophomore year, I met Matt deQuina, and I was smitten. 2 years later, we got married, and we were living in Indiana, and we were planning to move to Wisconsin a few months later. A couple months into our marriage, I went back for my regular heart checkup, and my doctor decided that I couldn't wait any longer to have that open heart surgery. So we scheduled it. I remember the date. It was supposed to be September 17, 2008, and a couple weeks before that, I went in for another heart catheterization. Once my heart catheterization was done, my doctors gave us the very surprising news that my heart looked fine. He told me personally that my heart looked like I had just had a new valve replaced, and I was good as new. I was good to go. I didn't have to have that surgery. I was initially supposed to have my valve replaced at the age of 13, and then it got changed to 16, and then it got changed to 20, and here I am at 22. They said it would be detrimental if I didn't have it replaced, and then I didn't have to have it replaced. It was just amazing how God worked that out, and I don't know why he allowed me to continue on without that promised surgery, but he did. Matt and I moved to Wisconsin shortly after that heart catheterization, and we joined the awesome church family that is Faith Baptist Church. A couple years into our marriage, we were expecting our first baby. Throughout the years growing up, all of my cardiologists were in agreement that if I had a baby, I would only be able to have one baby, and I would have to have the baby before I turned 30, and I would 100% have to have a C-section, and there would also be the possibility that my baby would have a heart defect. Although my pregnancy was high risk, I delivered a healthy baby boy in October of 2010, and although it was a difficult delivery, no C-section was needed. 8 years later, into my 30s, I delivered a healthy baby girl, and no C-section was needed. A C-section would have been fine. I was expecting it, but for some reason, God allowed me to not go through any of those problems that my doctors told me I would go through, and it's just been so cool to see him perform miracle after miracle throughout my life. So I've had my ups and downs throughout life, just like anyone else. God never promised an easy life to anyone, and I've seen my fair share of tragedies, but God has always been there with me every step of the way. And the verse that has always jumped out to me throughout my life has been Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not unto thine own understanding. It doesn't matter what trial we face, God is always a step ahead, and if we just acknowledge him, he will direct our paths.